From Ryan Garcia facing a mole in his camp, to Max Holloway having to spar on Zoom to train for his fights, here are fighters that had their fight camp ruined. Ryan Garcia's camp problems couldn't have come at a worse time. We all saw Garcia get TKO'd by Davis. That thunderous punch to his liver stopped him in his tracks, taking away all hope of him coming home with the win. But now, we're hearing news about a mole in Ryan's camp. Apparently, his sparring partner wasn't his biggest fan and ended up injuring him on purpose. To be fair, Garcia's camp ended up firing the dude, so I'd say they solved their problem. Though it was a bit too late by then, and the damage was done. According to sources, Erdenbaum and Ryan were busy sparring when things got a bit too real, and the youngster had to pay a visit to the hospital after getting clobbered by the mole. As things stand, Garcia's team still hasn't figured out who it was who planted this dude in their camp, or whether he's even a real mole or not. Erdenbaum himself came out and addressed these issues, and seemed offended about being accused of messing up Ryan's fight. Honestly, it's understandable he feels that way, because if you take a closer look at things, you'll quickly see that he didn't do much else, except what he was hired to do, and that was to help Garcia get used to the idea of going up against Tank. He also came out and talked about how he'd only gotten paid half of his salary after getting fired from the camp. You have to wonder whether it was Davis who set Ryan up for failure. From what I can tell, all signs seem to be pointing at Tank. After the fight, Davis admitted to knowing about his opponent's injuries. The only problem was these injuries hadn't been made public yet. So the question is, how did Gervonta know? This means he had an inside man in Garcia's camp. Sure, no actual proof has been brought to light, but things couldn't be any clearer. If you saw the fight, you'd have noticed that Davis was specifically targeting the speedy youngster's body instead of trying to knock him out like usual. This further proves that Gervonta was on some shady before his fight with Garcia. If he did win their fight by unfair means, then he doesn't have much of a leg to stand on whenever he calls himself the new face of boxing. It's a pretty dumb thing to do, and an even dumber way to get caught. The least he could have done was to get a bit more creative with how he deal with Ryan in the ring. I guess some people just don't have it in themselves to win fair and square. Still, nothing's been proven yet, and no action's been taken against anybody. With the way things are going, Davis might just be able to get away with the whole thing without so much as a slap on the wrist. You know, Garcia's not the only one out there who got injured during a brutal training camp. Darren Till suffered from a brutal eye poke weeks before his fight with Dricus du Plessis. Fighters getting injured during their training camps is slowly becoming more and more common. It's gotten to the point where it severely affects the outcome of fights, and not in a good way. A good example of this is Darren Till. The man was going through his normal routine when he attempted a takedown during training. That might have been the worst decision he's made in a while, because he ended up getting poked in his eye very badly. When asked about the injury, he said that he felt the finger reach into the back of his brain. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds insanely scary to me. What's worse is that he almost had to pull out of yet another fight, and if you've been following his career, that would have been pretty bad. For a few days after the injury, Till said that the pain kept getting worse, and he'd given up hope of fighting anytime soon. Thankfully, the injury decided to calm down, and he got fixed up in time for his bout. Even though he was fine after a while, there's no doubt in my mind about how scared he must have been when it first happened. Though not all camps end with their fighters getting hurt, like when Nick Diaz's trainers decided to skip some major training before his fight with GSP. Back in UFC 158, Nick Diaz was set to face off against St. Pierre. Considering GSP was one of the best pound-for-pound fighters at the time, you'd think Nick's coaches would be working extra hard during training. Though that couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Diaz's jiu-jitsu coach, Cesar Gracie, decided it was best to ignore his fighter till the very end. He didn't even bother setting him up with some proper training partners. It turned out that Diaz had to call some of his other fighter buddies to help him train. Even they couldn't do much, because they had their own fights coming up, which meant they couldn't strain their bodies too much.
Yeah, well, he was eating a lot of punches, so his thing was, he throws leg kicks, I throw punches, so for all the leg kicks I was taking, he was taking, more punches, and I started feeling it out and started checking the kicks.
It was a different story for GSP though. Firas Zahabi had him hopped up on the ultimate training program. He had all his fighters fight like Diaz, so it would help GSP understand what he was up against. At the end of the day, Nick had lost that fight before it even began. Maybe if his coaches had cared a tiny bit more, the bout would have ended differently. A lot of people thought that Nick would end up changing training camps, though he squashed that rumor pretty quick. Still, it sucks he had to go through all that because of his coaches being lazy. It turns out Nick Diaz isn't the only fighter who had to go through this, because LeVar Johnson went through the same thing. Before his fight against Brendan Schaub, LeVar Johnson isn't just another fighter on the UFC fighter roster, he's actually a pretty talented guy who's just had some issues with his coaches. See, it all went down on the road to UFC 157. Johnson was slated to have a showdown against Schaub, and almost everybody expected LeVar to wipe the floor with his opponent. However, it looks like his coaches had other plans. They had one job, and it was to get him good at his ground game. Though somehow, they managed to train him in everything, except his BJJ skills. So when the fight finally rolled around, Johnson was able to destroy Brendan during the stand-up game. Though when Schaub decided to take the fight to the ground, it was a totally different ball game. Johnson's opponent attempted a total of 5 takedowns, and LeVar wasn't able to stop even one. Couple that with 8 guard passes, and Schaub ended up winning the bout with ease. Goes to show why fighters who favor just their striking game can't thrive in modern MMA. You need to have a balanced skill set, or you can kiss your chances of dominating in the octagon goodbye. Hopefully, this fight knocks some sense into Johnson's coaches, because if he ever wants to make something of himself in this sport, he's going to have to level up big time. This next fighter couldn't do anything about his training camp because the whole thing was out of his control. Of course, I'm talking about Max Holloway and the COVID fiasco. While everyone else on this list had problems with their coaches, Max Holloway faced a different kind of problem. He went head-to-head against a whole-ass pandemic. See, he had a fight coming up against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 251. Now the problem was that he couldn't leave his house to train and was forced to prep for the fight at home, with his coaches telling him what to do on Zoom. When he talked about the fight later on, he called it the most difficult experience of his life. I mean, I get it. It can't be easy to prepare for a whole fight without physically sparring against another person for all those months. The worst part is that it wasn't even up to him because, believe me, he talked about considering going out. Though the problem with that was, the moment the police would see him out of his house, he'd get arrested. Since he's a public figure, he had an even bigger responsibility on his shoulders, as he had to set a good example for all US normies. Thankfully, unlike everybody else I mentioned in this video, Holloway didn't suffer too much from the lack of training. In fact, it helped him realize a few things.
To be the best, you gotta beat the best, and the best is blessed. They can come after me, baby. Let's get it.
Such as the fact that when you reach a certain level, you don't really need to spar that much anymore. You know the basics, and you know how to apply them. At a certain point, it just becomes a matter of becoming a student of the game and studying your opponents down to a T and just giving it your all in the octagon. So, from Max Holloway having to spar on Zoom, to train for his fights, to Ryan Garcia facing a mole in his camp, those were fighters who had their fight camp ruined.